We should make a very clear distinction here that often when people are embittered and resentful and feel like they're victims, it's because really awful things have happened to them. Now, not always, but often. And so then the question is, well, if you're in a situation and something really awful is happened to you or has happened to you, then, well, why shouldn't you feel like a victim? And is there a better alternative? And part of what you were trying to lay out in this part of the book is what those better alternatives are. So part of looking for that hero is to find out from someone else's example. In your case, it was your mother, but these other sources that you described, of people who were in a sort of hell, in an undeniable sense, but who chose in a very real way to make it as good as it could possibly be given the circumstances. And so they had to turn to sources of power, let's say, and strength and fortitude and resilience that weren't, in some sense, obviously associated with the catastrophe. I mean, in your mother's case, it's a pretty tragic situation. She's a young mother, she has young kids, now she has breast cancer, and she fights a losing battle over a period of 5 years. That's pretty bad. And then you have to ask yourself, given that that's obviously pretty bad, how is it even possible that someone could handle that with not only grace and courage, but the kind of grace and courage that leaves their children with an immovable sense of the ability to prevail in the face of the deepest adversity. I mean, that's really something. You said here, thousands have come before you and they did just fine. So quit your complaining. And it's not because you have nothing to complain about. That's not the case. It's that that's not the right approach. The fact is, and this is such an optimistic fact, as well as a judgment in some sense, the fact is that if someone else can do it, so can you. And that's something, right? If you're reading about the great heroes in history, people who are in these terrible situations, and you see someone rise to the occasion, and then you can say, well, that was a person who did that, and I'm a person, and so maybe I have that capacity too, even though I don't know how to approach it. And then some of the rest of your book, much of the rest of your book, I would say in some sense is a guide to help people figure out how they could approach that. One of the things you point out first is, well, notice who you admire. And then maybe try consciously practicing becoming like that. It's known from and unpredictability and humor about you. And there should be some play in the system, right? Because that's what stops you from just being the narrow, dead, past letter of the law with no spirit. There should be some snake inside the tree, right? There should be some fire inside the bush. Those are all ways of construing that are symbolically equivalent. There should be some dynamism in you, and a fair bit of that's associated with, well, enthusiasm. That's fun, but enthusiasm means to be imbued with the Spirit of God. That's why people like comedians so much too, because that's what they do. And so you have to leaven the duty with humor, and your book does a lovely job of that too, because your book, which is a very conservative book in the best possible way, and is a call to duty and responsibility, but you constantly return to themes of both stoicism and humor, which are tied together in some sense, you know. I was just in Newfoundland for the last week doing a documentary there, and Newfoundland's a rough rock, and it's beautiful and harsh, and the people there are tough and resilient, man, because they had to be. And Newfies have a great sense of humor, and they're always making fun, and that's a necessary leaven, right? That ability to deal with serious matters with a light touch, and it's something I'm trying to learn to do more and more, even in the most serious of conversations, you know, because if you're a master, you've got both. You've got that light touch and that sense of humor. You really see that in military people who've been through rough situations. When you see someone in the depths of genuine suffering, hopefully what you're trying to do is to throw a lifeline, and one possible lifeline is compassion. And that's probably the right lifeline to throw an infant, you know, who's suffering, that sort of overwhelming compassion. But for someone who is an adult or making progress towards being an adult, the lifeline that might be thrown is there's something within you that would let you be more than you are, and much more, and maybe enough more so that you could actually deal with this suffering so it didn't turn into hell and take everything along with it. And there isn't anything more optimistic than that. You say something here, which I think is extremely, I'm going to read something from your book here. It is true that character is to some extent innate. I would say what that does is that it provides each of us with a range of talents and a range of temptations. And so it's something like that. So it's the hand we're dealt, and there's certainly a genetic element to that. Our genetic makeup imbues in us certain proclivities. But it is as true that character is mostly a consequence of choices. Strangely enough, we all make them, and we should make them deliberately, with the knowledge that these choices are part of our responsibility toward a purpose other than our own selfish aims. That responsibility is to your family, friends, community, and country. That's something that conservatives put forward as a pathway to virtue. You know, and what's so interesting about that, as far as I'm concerned, as an antidote to atomistic liberalism, let's say, that hyper-privileges the individual, is that it's definitely been my observation as a clinical psychologist that in the depths of misery, the capability that you have to be of service to other people, your family, your friends, your community, your country, that's actually a saving grace under such circumstances. You know, and that people really find a deep and abiding meaning in that service. So it's not just finger wagging and the pointing towards duty. It's like, no, you don't understand that if you're in desperate straits, if your life has fallen apart, if you're nihilistic and miserable, and maybe you have your bloody reasons, because maybe you do, that's still the case that if you step outside yourself and you try to make the lives of other people better, that's the best possible thing that you can do for yourself. The you that emerges as a consequence of your latest catastrophe is everything that you were before plus something more. And that actually constitutes what you might describe as measurable progress, right? And that's another argument against moral relativism, because if you can do everything that you could do before and you can do some more things, we could just define that as better. It's not a bad definition. And then we have an up. It's like what you're trying to do is to differentiate the world and differentiate yourself. And every time you undergo one of these revolutions, then hopefully both of those things happen. And then there's a moral to that story too, which is do it voluntarily, and maybe do it. Don't wait for it to happen catastrophically. Keep your eyes open. And when something goes a little bit wrong that you could fix it. Don't say, no, that doesn't matter. Maybe it does matter. Maybe it is matter. Maybe it's exactly the matter out of which you should be built. Maybe it's the matter out of which the world should be built. And if part of you is telling you it matters, what it means is that that part is telling you that there's something there that you need to engage with. That's what it means for something to matter. I really get a kick out of the word matter, because it's got these two weird meanings, right? There's the matter that everything is made out of, that materialists think everything is made out of, and that's just dead matter. And then there's the matter that life is made out of, which is what matters. And now and then you're moving through life and something matters. It's calling to you. And that's the unrevealed world trying to reveal itself to you. And all you have to do is allow it to reveal itself to you. And then maybe what happens is that a minor shift in shape is all that has to happen to you. You don't have to burn right down to the bloody egg and hatch out, as a newborn. Maybe you can just repair a little bit of something that's gone wrong with you. And so you can undergo a sequence of continual micro-deaths instead of waiting for the bloody catastrophe that might send you so far down that you'll never recover. And all you have to do is attend to what matters. And your whole nervous system it's doing this for you. You've got a goal. Something happens. It matters. So what are you supposed to do with that? You're supposed to fix it. You're supposed to engage with it. That's why it's calling out to you as if it matters. It's saying there's an indeterminate part of the world here that wants to manifest itself into fully articulated being. And it's calling to you to do that. And if you ignore it, then it accumulates. And if it accumulates, it turns into the dragon of chaos. And then it waits until you're not at your best, and then it eats you. And that's the alternative. So that seems like a bad plan. In the Mesopotamian rituals, the Mesopotamians would act out the collapse of the kingdom into chaos, essentially, at the New Year's festival. It's kind of what you do when you make resolutions, because it's a degenerate, what you'd say is our proclivity to make New Year's resolutions, sort of a degenerate ritual. And I don't mean that it's bad. I mean that it's the remnants of something much grander. So the idea was, the Mesopotamians would take their emperor outside the city, the walled city, and once a year, and they would make him kneel, and they'd take off all his king clothes, and then they'd whack him with a glove, if I remember correctly. The priest would do that, and then they'd make him recount all the ways that he wasn't being a good emperor that year. He wasn't being a good Marduk, because that was who he was supposed to be on earth, and that's the guy with eyes all the way around his head, speaks magic words, and transforms chaos into order. That's what the emperor is supposed to do. And so the question would be, okay, you're emperor. It's like, have a little humility here, because you're not God incarnate. You probably made some mistakes. Can you think of any ways in the last year that you didn't take every advantage of every opportunity you possibly could have to take some spare chaos and transform it into habitable order? That's a good thing to think about. Well, that's what you're thinking about when you make a New Year's resolution, even though you don't know it. It's like, could you be a better person in the upcoming year? Well, you can imagine the flood, and then you can set yourself straight, and then you can prepare for it. And that means maybe you can stave it off, but it also means that maybe even if you don't stave it off, you can ride it out. And that's actually the story of Noah. Because what happens with Noah is that he can see that things are not good, and that there's a flood coming. And God is maybe letting him know. And it says in the story that Noah walked with God. Remember, and that's what Adam did before he got all self-conscious about the whole thing. He walked with God. We'll talk about that more next time. But what that would mean maybe is because Noah was straight, and he put himself together, and his familial relationships were good, because it also says that his antennae were working. And he could see a little farther into the future than someone whose vision was completely obscured by fog and chaos. And he could tell that things were not going to go well. And so he prepared for it. And because he prepared for it, well, then things actually went pretty well for Noah, even though the flood came. And the same applies in your own life, is that there are floods coming. You can bloody well be sure of that. That's absolutely 100% certain. Some of them are going to be personal. Some of them are going to be familial. Some of them are going to be social and political and economic. It's like, are they going to be catastrophes for you? Or are you going to ride them out? Are you going to prepare? Well, the first issue might be, well, do you have your act together well enough to see them coming with enough advance warning so that you can take proper measures? Maybe just to sidestep it. Maybe just don't go where the flood is going to be. That's a simple thing. But maybe you don't have that luxury, right? And so it is going to be a catastrophe. Maybe someone in your family is going to get really, really sick, right? And maybe there's just a tiny pathway through that everything doesn't fall apart. It doesn't end in divorce. It doesn't end in death. It doesn't end in sorrow. It doesn't end in catastrophe. But the margin of error is like slimmed down to virtually zero. And every imperfection that you bring to that situation is going to increase the probability that that tragedy is going to turn into something indistinguishable from hell. And that's coming. It's coming your way. Absolutely, certainly. And so then you might think, well, since it's coming your way, matter that you do what you can to walk with God. Like I said, we'll talk more about that next time. And it might be that is how you build an ark and are protected from the flood, even if the damn thing comes. And the thing is, it will. One of the things that's very interesting about Exodus is that when God tells the pharaonic tyrant to free the Israelites, he always uses the same phrase, and you only ever hear half the phrase. He has Moses say, "Let my people go." Now you hear that phrase all the time. I think that's true, deeply true. Purpose is meaning, and meaning is happiness. We don't think about happiness enough, and when we do not necessarily think about it properly. Happiness is neither joy nor entertainment. It is an ontological condition fundamental to our existence as humans. It's notable that when the founders drafted the Declaration of Independence, they listed up front three things to which we are all entitled: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A little later you say, you need to understand that your purpose may be great in the eyes of the world, or it may be commonplace and seemingly small. Your purpose might be your family, your children. It might be tutoring a child and changing their life. It might be the business you started. It might be cleaning up your block. It might be in the help you give others. It might be in the example you set. And then you say, as John Adams said, Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. And so I love
that you should want to give charity. And I said, Jesus wasn't saying that you should take from others and make them give charity. That wasn't what he said. You need to be generous with your belongings, with your time, with your labor. That's what he was saying. It was a generosity of the heart, not a demand on others.
That's right. Well, that's absolutely 100% correct. It's an injunction towards the highest form of self-sacrifice. Period. The end. Obviously, that's what the crucifixion means, the acceptance of that catastrophic death, all of the, what would you say, the tragedy of life, and then even a further radical acceptance of the necessity to confront hell. That's self-sacrifice. That is not calling for moral actions on the part of others on your behalf. Definitely 100% not. And that self-sacrifice is called upon even if you're innocent, right? So it's even more than that. You want to have the ability to delay gratification. You know, that ties in with what we talked about earlier about being able to treat yourself as if you're a community across time. Because to delay gratification means to sacrifice the hedonism of the present to the security and iterability of the future. And so that is a hallmark of maturity. That's also the ability to make sacrifices. That's why the sacrificial motif is stressed so hard in the Old Testament. You have to make sacrifices. To what? Well, to whatever you value. Well, what's the highest value? Well, by definition, that's God. So do you sacrifice to God? Well, if you sacrifice at all, you sacrifice to a God. Maybe you don't sacrifice. Well, then you're immature. Maybe you sacrifice to a lesser God. Then maybe you should get your act together. That's all tied together integrally with the notion of the ability to delay gratification. That's why God tells Adam and Eve that they're condemned to work when they get thrown out of the Garden of Eden. It's like, well, now you have to work because you're aware of the future. Well, that's a call to sacrifice because work is a sacrificial act. And then the question is, in service of what?
And there's another chapter in the book called Do Something Hard. It's pretty direct and straightforward there. But what we're getting at is that there's a problem in our society where we do our best to alleviate any kind of suffering, as if we feel that there's this utopia available to us where suffering can be completely removed from our lives. But that's a false promise. That's a false God. It's impossible. And worse than that, it prevents that sacrifice that you're talking about. It prevents that uphill climb because people are told to feel that there's some sense of injustice if you have to work harder than anyone else for something and you know, and they're blinded as to why. And look, maybe you do have to work harder than someone else to get to the same point. I'm not saying that's impossible, but
we all do. That's true for all of us, right? Because with our genetic inheritance, let's say, some things come relatively easy to us and some things are virtually impossible and have to be strived for mightily. And I'm also not saying that some people aren't, what would you say, condemned in some fundamental way in multiple dimensions simultaneously. I mean, I've had people in my clinical practice and met people in my private life who are burdened by so many difficulties simultaneously that it's almost incomprehensible. So I'm not what you're doing, and you don't know if you should change course. Set yourself the obligation to choose something more difficult before you change course. Because there's a moral hazard, right? It's like, well, am I unhappy or am I just useless? It's like, well, a little of column A and a little of column B. Well, how do I fortify myself against my uselessness? I don't allow myself to switch course unless the challenge increases. And that works, you know, it's a check against your own laziness and inertia and envy and resentment. Because you know then too, you can say to yourself, well, I moved from there. I didn't fail, I didn't quit, I chose something more difficult. And so I can have some faith in my choice. Maybe I can have some faith in my choice because you accepted a bigger challenge. I was a very small person in my classes and also very mouthy, which might not come as much of a surprise, and somewhat provocative. And so, you know, and I got pushed around a fair bit because everybody gets pushed around, and my weapon was to be mouthy, and it was a fairly effective weapon, although it tended to backfire because, you know, if you're really effectively mouthy with large obnoxious people, then they tend to respond in a relatively negative physical way, and so that sort of thing was happening to me a fair bit. But I was quite proud of the fact that I had some intellectual power, and it was then in my 20s when I learned about some of the danger of that, because I'd started to read partly Milton's Paradise Lost, and I started to understand the danger of the intellect. And the danger of the intellect, as far as I can tell, is that it tends towards pride and arrogance, and it also tends to fall in love with its own productions. And so that's actually Lucifer in Paradise Lost. That's Lucifer. Lucifer is the intellect that falls in love with its own productions and then assumes that there's nothing outside of what it thinks. That's the totalitarian mentality, right? It's like we have a total system and we know how everything works, and we're going to implement it, and that'll bring about heaven on earth, right? That's the totalitarian mindset, and that's associated with intellectual arrogance. And at the same time, another thing was happening to me. So I was noticing that. I started to understand what that meant. And I also started to understand that there was more to life than the intellect, much more. Because I smoked too much, and I drank too much, and I weighed like 130 pounds. I wasn't in good physical shape. And like I had a lot of things to do when I went to graduate school to put myself together. And at the same time, I was trying to understand why things had gone so crazily wrong with the world. Its encapsulation in the Cold War, and what role I might be playing in that, if any, or what role any of us were playing in that. At the same time, I was working at a prison, only a little bit. I worked with this crazy psychologist. He used to put jokes on his multiple choice tests. He was a really eccentric guy, but I really liked his courses. He taught a course on creativity, and he was also a prison psychologist, and he was an eccentric guy, and he for some reason liked me, and maybe because I was eccentric too, and he invited me to go out to the Edmonton maximum security prison with him a couple of times, which I did, and that was a very interesting experience because I was trying to figure out what role each individual's behavior bore to the pathology of the group. It was something like that. And I went out there and I met a little guy, smaller than me. I was a little bigger by then. And he was a pretty innocuous guy. And what had happened was I was out in this gymnasium. It looks like a high school, a prison, which is really quite telling in my estimation. And there were all these like monsters in there weightlifting, and like they were monsters. I remember one guy who was tattooed everywhere, and he had like a huge scar running down the middle of his chest. It looked like someone had hit him with an axe, and you know, and I was in there, and I had this weird cape that I used to wear that I bought in Portugal, and some boots that went along with it. And yeah, it was like an 1890s Sherlock Holmes cape, and it was really like it was from the 1890s because this little village was up on a hill. It was a walled city on a hill, and they sold these things, and I don't think they'd changed the style since 1890, and so I thought they were really cool, and so I was wearing that, which wasn't perhaps the most conservative garb to don if you're going to go to a maximum security prison. So anyways, I was in the gymnasium, and the psychologist left, and God only knows. I mean, that's what he was like. And all these guys came around me, you know, and they were offering to trade their prison clothes for my cape, and it was it was like I was being made an offer I couldn't refuse, you know, and so I didn't really know what to do. And then this little guy said something like that the psychologist sent me to come and take you away or something like that. And so I thought, well, better this little guy than all these monsters. So we went outside the gym through some doors, like school doors. We went outside the gym into the exercise yard, I guess. And we were wandering along, and he was talking to me, and he seemed like a kind of an innocuous guy. And then the psychologist showed up at the door and motioned us back. Okay? And so, which was kind of a relief. And so I went into his office, and he said, "You know that guy that you walked out in the yard with?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, he took two cops one night, and he had them kneel down, and while they were begging for their lives, he shot them both in the back of the head. And I thought, that's See, the thing that was so interesting was that he was so innocuous. Right? Because what you'd hope is that someone like that would be very much unlike you, let's say, and certainly wouldn't be like someone innocuous that you'd met. What you'd want is that the guy would be like, you know, half werewolf and half vampire. So you could just tell right away that he was a cold-blooded killer. But no, he was this sort of ineffectual little guy who was certainly not ineffectual if you gave him a revolver and the upper hand. And so that made me think. That made me think a lot about the relationship between being innocuous and being dangerous. And then another thing happened. I met another guy out there. And then a week or two later, I heard that he and a friend of his had held another guy down and pulverized his left leg with a lead pipe. Like, just pulverized it. And the reason for that was that they thought that he was a snitch. And maybe he was. And that time I did something different. Instead of being shocked and horrified by that, although I certainly was, I thought, how in the world could you do that? Because I didn't think I could do that. Eh? I didn't think that. I thought that there was a qualitative distinction between me and those people. And so I spent about 2 weeks trying to see if I could figure out under what conditions I could do that. Like what kind of psychological transformation I would have to undergo to be able to do that. And so that was a meditative exercise, let's say. And it only took about 10 days for me to realize that not only could I do that, that it would be a hell of a lot easier than I thought it would be. And that's sort of where that wall between me and what Jung described as the shadow started to fall apart. And that also was very useful because I started to treat myself as a somewhat different entity because I hadn't been aware up to that point. You know, because I thought I was a good guy. And there's no reason for me to think that, because you're not a good guy unless you've really made a bloody effort to be a good guy. You're just not. It's not easy. And so you're probably a moderately bad guy. And that's a long ways from being an absolutely horrible guy, but it's also a long ways from being a good guy. And so, but I had a little like that. It was, well, people have multiple parts. So then I had this weird conundrum. It was like, well, which of these two things are me? Is it the part that's listening and saying, no, that's rubbish, that's a lie, you're doing that to impress people, you're just trying to win the argument, you know. Was that me, or was the part that was going about my normal verbal business me? And I didn't know, but I decided I would go with the critic. And then what I tried to do, what I learned to do, I think, was to stop saying things that made me weak. And now that, I mean, I'm still trying to do that because I'm always feeling when I talk whether or not the words that I'm saying are either making me align or making me come apart. And I think the alignment, I really do think the alignment I think alignment is the right way of conceptualizing it, because I think if you say things that are as true as you can say them, let's say, then they come out of the depths inside of you. Because we don't know where thoughts come from. We don't know how far down into your substructure the thoughts emerge. We don't know what processes of physiological alignment are necessary for you to speak from the core of your being. We don't understand any of that. We don't even conceptualize that, but I believe that you can feel that. And I learned some of that from reading Carl Rogers, by the way, who's a great clinician. But anyways, I decided that I would start practicing not saying things that would make me weak. And what happened was that I had to stop saying almost everything that I was saying. I would say 95% of it. It's a hell of a shock to wake up and, I mean, this was over a few months, but it's a hell of a shock to wake up and realize that you're mostly dead wood. It's a shock. You know, and you might think, well, do you really want all of that to burn off? It's like, well, there's nothing left but a little husk, 5% of you. It's like, well, if that 5% is solid, then maybe that's exactly what you want to have happen. With regard to sexuality, you said that it is a good question to ask yourself. Who is in control? Well, yeah, that's the question, isn't it? You know, if you're masturbating to pornography and the consequence of that is an immediate influx of guilt, then you have to ask yourself who's in control. And that's a really important question, who's in control. That's what terrified me about developing some psychoanalytic acumen, because once you realize that you're a house that many spirits can and do inhabit, and that many of them aren't you, and that many of them aren't working towards the purposes you might want yourself to be working to, and that's the realization of the myth that you're embodying from the Jungian perspective. It's a very, very serious question. The fundamental human myth is Cain versus Abel. And so who are you? Are you Cain or Abel? Well, the answer is you're both. And then the question is, well, who's got the upper hand? And then the next question is, who do you want to have the upper hand? Is it God and Abel or Satan and Cain? And that's a question that's just as germane to non-believers as it is to believers. And isn't that remarkable and appalling and overwhelming and terrifying all at the same time, if you have any sense of what it means? So if your behavior is embarrassing you, well, there's only two possibilities, isn't there? You shouldn't be so embarrassed. And I suppose the voice that says yes to all expression of human sexuality would say that your guilt and shame is merely the detrimental hangover of an oppressive patriarchy that's judgmental in its attitudes towards sexuality. Well, yeah, well, what would you use judgment to differentiate if it isn't sexuality? If you're ashamed about your sexual behavior, then you have to ask yourself, is the shame wrong or is the sexual behavior wrong? And I'm asking you, I'm not judging your behavior, because what the hell do I know about you? And I have enough trouble with my own behavior, so, you know, this is on you. Is your shame what you should be dispensing with, or the behavior? And, you know, it might be a little of column A and a little of column B, because life is never simple. But if you don't feel ennobled by your porn-related masturbation, then perhaps that means it's of questionable utility. I certainly don't see it as a stabilizing social force. I don't see it as something people do in public and brag about. And I know that sexual behavior is private and should remain that way, but you get what I'm driving at. So, look, I think people shouldn't lie, especially to themselves. And I think repeatedly engaging in a behavior that you judge yourself to be morally reprehensible is a form of performative contradiction, which is the acting out of a lie. And I suspect you know that, or you wouldn't be asking the question. And so, you know, what should you do with pornography? Well, you know the answer to that, and so does everybody else. Everyone knows it's not good. It's not good for those who produce it. It's not good for those who participate, wittingly or unwittingly, because there's plenty of them, in its production. It's not good for its consumers, or certainly not the highest good. And what's the highest good? Sexuality incorporated within functional, intimate relationship, bound by vows of mutual celibacy. And we all know that too. That stabilizes our families. It stabilizes our societies. It stabilizes our psyches. And so anything you do that isn't in service of that goal is likely to be counterproductive. And I suspect it's your own psyche, your own soul telling you that. So if your sexual behavior isn't an expression of your highest being, then it isn't serving you in the deepest sense. You're serving it. And that's what your shame indicates. So get out there and find a partner and commit to her or him.
Yeah, so testosterones are associated with wins. Do winners tend to be able to win more? There's some, et cetera. But, if we want to bring this into the common world, a few years back when I started doing some public-facing education, I started getting a lot of questions, especially on YouTube, from young males about pornography and masturbation. And this becomes very relevant here. We have to remember that this dopaminergic system is generalizable to many different behaviors, right? Academic pursuits, sports pursuits, relationship pursuits. But fundamentally, it's tacked into the adaptive survival behaviors. And every species, including ours, has at least two major motivations, which is to protect its young and to make more of itself, to make more young at some level. People can opt out of that, but one of the absolutely pathologic situations for any animal or human is to be able to access repeated dopamine surges without effort or any pursuit that's self-directed, or that's directed, I should say. So for instance, cocaine, a drug which potently increases dopamine, or methamphetamine, which potently increases methamphetamine, but doesn't require any sort of adaptive action pursuit except to acquire the drug and spend money on it. No sacrifice. So what ends up happening is the circuit that gets rewarded is only the drug-seeking behavior, and no other behavior will give the kind of potent dopamine release that cocaine or methamphetamine will, which is why they are so pernicious. Now, likewise, right. I'm not...
Well, plus they have that powerful reinforcing effect, right? So not only do you get that kick, but what's reinforced by the dopamine release is the behaviors that were particularly right prior to the ingestion. And if all that is the drug-taking behavior, that's all that develops.
That's right.
You build that monster inside your head.
That's right.
So I can see where you're going on the pornography.
Right. So I was starting to get a lot of questions. I was kind of surprised. I thought, well, I'm male, and maybe that's why they feel comfortable asking. But people were saying were asking about pornography, and they were asking, I realize we want to, I'll just be direct about it. They were asking whether or not masturbation was bad. They were asking whether or not masturbation with ejaculation was particularly bad. And here's my stance on this. I'm a biologist and a neuroscientist, not a psychologist. But what we know for sure is that if an individual repeatedly engages in this circuitry, let's say masturbation and pornography, with increasingly potent forms of stimulation that are on a screen, a couple of things happen. First of all, what's being reinforced? What's being reinforced is a high dopaminergic response to watching other people engage in sexual behavior, which is very different than being in a first-person sexual experience. Okay? So right there, that what's being reinforced is not actually any kind of improvement in communication skills. It's voyeurism. And as these questions started to come in more and more, I started to realize there was a lot of kind of undertones of people talking about fear of or experience with sexual dysfunction that clearly pornography can lead to. And here I'm specifically talking about males. I actually don't know the literature on females. So here I'm talking about...
Females don't use visual pornography to the same degree.
I see.
They use literary pornography.
I see. So... So, and then you start to think about, okay, what happens in the cascade or the arc of sexual arousal and orgasm? What happens is that initially there's it's parasympathetically dominant, meaning if somebody is too stressed, they actually can't engage in sexual behavior. The arousal response doesn't occur. Erection is blunted, but the actual orgasm response and ejaculation is strongly associated with the so-called sympathetic nervous system, which has nothing to do with sympathy. It has everything to do with, it's a kind of a stress response. And then it reverses to a parasympathetic response. And a hormone called prolactin increases dramatically after ejaculation in males. What does that do? That blunts dopamine release and testosterone for a very long period of time, which makes sense if pair bonding and sort of, in our species anywhere, there's this idea that then other molecules will be exchanged with partners, pair bonding, potential for raising mates, etc. Without getting into a huge discussion about that, the point is this. Masturbation and pornography are potently tapping into the dopamine system and can undermine the very processes of what I consider healthy processes of finding a mate, dating, communication. The dopamine, remember, dopamine goes up during pursuit, anticipation, then peaks and then crashes below baseline after orgasm and ejaculation. So this kind of low that people fear is putting them into an amotivated state. We can think of this, if I were to kind of expand on it, would be it's this kind of neurochemical, psychological equivalent of making your home environment filthy for a while, not actually putting you into this positive amplification of dopamine. So it depletes the dopamine system. And it's likewise in drugs of abuse and addiction, it eventually depletes the dopamine system. Initially, there's a huge dopamine surge with drugs of abuse like methamphetamine and cocaine. But over time, people are using more and more to achieve what is not such a great high.
And do you have any advice on what to do with porn and masturbation? The less porn, the better. That's my advice. But let's make that more specific. To the degree that use of porn and masturbation is undermining your sense of yourself and providing you with a dearth of motivational reasons to get out there and engage with a real partner, then it's definitely not in your best interest, and that's what your conscience is telling you. And it's the expedient at the expense of the meaningful. Obviously, right? Obviously. There isn't any more obvious manifestation of the expedient at the expense of the meaningful than pornography and masturbation. And that's hardly a heroic path. So maybe the less of it, the better.